Okay, dear friends, if you would please, um, if I may have your attention, please. Welcome. Good morning. Um, please come in. The next year is the 50 years anniversary of the fishery management collaboration between Norwegian IMR and Russian PINRO, a collaboration which from the Cold War at its coldest until today has served as an extremely stable and important arrangement facilitating the growth of Russo-Norwegian fish stocks to an all-time high level today. Following this agreement, regional collaboration has grown in other sectors cross-border in the Barents region especially, or at least there has been much of that going on from an early stage in the Arctic. Cross and multinational science collaboration, indigenous people collaboration, the Rovaniemi process leading to the establishment of the Arctic Council, and in recent years a greater emphasis on economic collaboration with the establishment of the Arctic Economic Council. All of these collaboration programs and institutions of science and soft diplomacy has laid a solid foundation for a stable and peaceful development in and of the North. And as the world of international relations seems to become increasingly unstable and unpredictable, the Arctic stands out as a place of dialogue and peaceful collaboration across borders. And Arctic Frontiers, we are very happy to be invited to host this session on cultural relations and soft diplomacy here at the Arctic Arts Summit. Arctic Frontiers work to promote knowledge and sustainable development in the North. We have a one-week science policy and business conference in Tromsø in January each year. And increasingly arrangement both in Norway and abroad the rest of the year. Please come in. We are very happy to see that culture is brought higher on the agenda, and I would like to express my respect and admiration to Maria Utsi and her team for lifting this sector higher on the Arctic agenda and for lifting this conference, the Arctic Arts Summit. Truly impressive. Culture has a particular role and value in circumpolar relations. Like science, it has a stabilizing effect in the Arctic region. The cultural dimension, which is yet to be fully developed in the Arctic, might be, developed to become a platform for transnational collaboration in general. I'm very glad that the summit lifts the people, culture and art into the general discourse on Arctic development. And with this outstanding panel, we will try to find where arts and culture fit into the soft diplomacy of the North. So please let me introduce the panel. Ole Fredrikson, Director of the Arctic Economic Council. Ethan Berkowitz, Mayor of Anchorage, Alaska. Naya Bianco, Senior Advisor, Nordic Council of Ministers. Mr. Tom Fries, Communication Director at the Arctic Council Secretariat. And Julie Decker, Director, Anchorage Museum at Rasmus Center. We will have a discussion now with some main questions and topics, and then we will leave like 5-10 minutes open for questions at the end of the session. I would like to address the first question to you, Julie. How can the role of culture be developed in the Arctic collaboration?
Good morning. Is it on?
It's on.
Okay, good morning. I think for a long time, the arts and culture sector operated with somewhat of an inferiority complex, kind of waiting to be invited to the dance and be invited to the table to have a conversation with business and industry at various gatherings. But I think the field needs to make its way to the table, and I think with this conference, perhaps we have. We've long been interested in developing more cross-sector conversations rather than siloed ones. We think there's powerful collaborations that are underway, and that the Arctic is really an ecosystem, that you can't take one sector and examine the Arctic, that really it needs to be a cross between science and business and industry and governance and social structures and health and design and arts and culture. And without the last three, you don't have the human element of how people live in the Arctic. So we think arts and culture has a powerful role to play in building collaborations, and we think it's time for all of us to be at the table together and establish one narrative rather than several.
Thank you, Julie. I would just a quick follow-up question to, or a question to Tom. What can we take away from the experience made from collaboration within the field of science? Please.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure how many of the people in the room are aware, but the Arctic Council recently signed its third binding agreement, which was on science cooperation specifically. And I think there are sort of three things that I see within that agreement that I think are also highly relevant in the realm of cultural cooperation. The first is that agreement specifically addresses intellectual property, which, especially when you're dealing with issues like traditional knowledge and traditional culture, is an extremely important aspect of cultural cooperation. It also specifically addresses traditional knowledge and its use within science. And finally, it addresses youth specifically and education. And I think that looking at the cultural programs that the Arctic Council at least has been involved in, youth is always a key component of that. It's not just about sort of the art initiative for its own sake, but about passing on traditions to future generations and getting future generations engaged in those things. I think just the second thing that I would point out is that science is by its nature sort of a very specific thing. I mean, when you're talking to a specific researcher, that person does something very specific. They're looking at gas hydrates on the floor of a very particular area of the Barents Sea or whatever. But what we see, at least in terms of how the Arctic Council helps with science cooperation, is that we have a convening power. We have a sort of gravitational pull that helps us to bring together a lot of these small bits and pieces that are happening around the circumpolar Arctic. And I think that's a structure that's important in cultural collaboration too, and that's something that could be expanded. Is really, there are great initiatives going on in Greenland, in Alaska, and bringing those together is an important next step, I think, in this area.
Thank you, Tom. Would the mayor of Alaska like to comment on that?
You know, science is about objective truth, and one of the challenges that we have in the world today is that we can't even disagree on a shared set of assumptions. And the more we can find truths that we can disagree with, the more we can forge solutions to problems that we face. One of the benefits of transitioning from science to arts is that we appeal to the humanity of people. And the more that we can appeal to the humanity of people, the more we can break down borders between nations. And as we have an increasingly uncertain international environment, the ability to cultivate relationships between individuals, between sectors in communities, gives stability and, I think, greater hope for peace moving forward. And I think ultimately that's one of the objectives that we're all striving for. Art is about making people think, making people feel, making people rise to the better natures of themselves, to their better angels. And if we don't cultivate it, then we allow, I think, the darker elements in society to move to the fore.
Thank you. Annie, you would like to comment on that?
Thank you, and good morning. I would just like to go actually back to the original question and state that, in my opinion, culture is actually the foundation of a lot of the regional and international cooperation that we do. If you look at the Cold War era in the Barents region, for example, culture was one of the fields where we had excellent cooperation between the Nordic countries and Russia. And that laid foundation for further cooperation in the fields of politics or fisheries or economics. And like the mayor said, it really appeals to the humanity of people. So culture is also about branding the nations, and then again, laying the foundation for diplomacy, for economics, etc.
Thank you, Anne. Tom, you would like to comment on that? Mikrofonene går bare på they just are for the live streaming. Yeah. Yes. Okay, then we must speak up.
Okay. Just a quick response then to, can you hear me reasonably well? Okay. A quick response to what Ethan said about the fact that when we're talking about culture and art, we're talking about humanity. So in the communications work that I do for the Arctic Council, it's very clear that the material that we do that is related to culture, whether we're talking food culture or art or music, that is what generates a response. Much more than the political things that the political messages that we push out or the scientific messages that we push out. What people respond to are those human components. That's all.
Thank you, Tom. Naya, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to comment on all the statements that have been made so far. I definitely agree that we should start the narrative about arts and culture in the Arctic, because that has been an area that hasn't been prioritized that much. Obviously, the climate and the environment and the nature agenda has been sort of filling up the whole agenda, including the science part, which is natural. That's where the whole sort of discussion on the Arctic started. But while we have this increasing interest for the Arctic, not only from the Arctic states, but also from other states in the world, we really need to get the understanding of the culture and the arts of the Arctic out there. Because culture and arts, they help giving a nuanced picture of the Arctic. The Arctic is not only about seals or polar bears or icebergs that are challenged by climate change. It's also there, but it's also about people living there, their cultural heritage, but also the modern culture of today. So I very much agree with Julie on the need for mobilizing the narrative about culture and arts in the Arctic. However, I don't think there's one narrative, because the Arctic is a region with several regions and with several specificities. So for example, I come from Greenland. It's a huge island, but with a small population of about 57,000 people. And it would be extremely important for all Greenlanders to also have a saying in that debate. But it's obviously difficult when only being 57,000 people. So we need to differentiate in our debate as well, while still having the grand narrative vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Thank you. Anu.
Thank you. Naya, I couldn't agree more with you when it comes to the image, diversifying the image of the Arctic. Because what I see very often when I'm traveling to countries down south is that the image of Arctic is really about icebergs and polar bears. And while that is also true, it's just a part of the picture. So we need to tell the people and educate them about the diversity of the Arctic, that we truly have 4G and infrastructure, at least in parts of the Arctic. So that is extremely important. I would also like to mention a project which was conducted at the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group. It's called IALU, and it's about reindeer herders' food culture. They're looking at it through the lenses of traditional knowledge and adaptation to climate change. And it also has an aspect of educating the youth. And I think this is a perfect example of something that brings in the traditional, the culture, but also the business thinking, because they are also developing this project, trying to see for new ways of exporting reindeer meat.
Please, Julie.
I just wanted to express arts and culture as the one continuum in the Arctic. It's not new, this conversation. It's not about introducing arts and culture to an Arctic conversation. It's about raising the profile of arts and culture in the Arctic conversation. Indigenous cultures have been here longer than any of us in any of these conversations. It's the constant. It's our future, and the artists have always been in and drawn to the Arctic. We're seeing an increase in interest and an influx of artists, just like we see an increase in business and industry and science. But those conversations are the constant. They've led policy for a long time. They have been the strongest collaborations. They exist without policy, without politics. So those cross-border conversations have been the richest exchange in the Arctic, I think. So for me, it's not about an introduction of this conversation. It's about expressing that continuum, including arts and culture as part of the overarching narrative of the Arctic. And I guess in a way, about using it to brand our place in addition to the other elements.
Thank you. The bridging between the Arctic, like traditional narrative, and the modern culture of today is, I think at least, is a very important part of what we ought to be discussing when we look at the Arctic as a region and the Arctic in relation to the rest of the world. Tom, is there a room here for these narratives and a stronger cultural component in the Arctic collaboration and maybe also in the Arctic Council?
Yeah, I mean that's a complicated question, but I think I would point back to a lot of what's already been said by some of my fellow panelists here. Anu was kind enough to point out the EALU project that's recently been completed by the SGWG with a lot of leadership by the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry and others. It was a broad, large, highly collaborative project. And what I see when I look at, or one thing that I notice when I look at that project is that culture, in air quotes here, is not something that you can sort of pull out and treat in isolation. And Julie described it really as part of an Arctic ecosystem, and I think that that's really that's the best way to look at it. In particular, when we're talking about small communities in and of themselves, small towns, but also the circumpolar Arctic as a whole, we're not talking about that many people, and we do a lot of things. We do a lot of things ourselves. The same people are engaged in culture, who are engaged in government, who are engaged in science. So this ecosystem, as Julie described it, means that there's absolutely space for these narratives. And not only is there space for it, it's, to use an expression, it helps to grease the wheels, if that makes sense. It helps to grease the machinery for other kinds of, for other important elements of the circumpolar collaboration.
Thank you, Tom. Why do we invest in cultural trans-border collaboration in general, and what are the effects that we wish to see? Nadia?
Well, maybe I should pick up on what Tom just said about greasing the wheels, because obviously, I think it's been mentioned here a couple of times as well, that we live in a time of relative tension. And even though the cooperation within the Arctic Council and in Arctic questions in general has not been that affected by, for example, the tension vis-a-vis Russia, there is still, we still live in a world with general tensions and with sort of trends that leads toward isolation. So obviously, even though we might have thought in the aftermath of the Second World War that the exchanges between people, we had done that enough and we had been through that, I actually think we need to go back to basics and see culture as part of the glue that binds us together, and a sort of a feature that makes us wiser on each other. So I think basic exchanges are really just very important still. And we might have pooled our efforts and our finances into a lot of other things, and we might actually need to go back to basics like exchanges. Because in exchanges, that's where it all happens, that's where we start understanding each other better.
Right. Anna, you would like to comment on that?
Thank you. I would just like to pick up from where Tom and Naya left about greasing the wheels and representing the economy or the business part in this panel. I think that culture has also a great role when it comes to branding. This is a word that I already mentioned in the start. I also have background from diplomacy prior to working for the AEC. And country branding, I noticed that it's very high on the agenda on most of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And there's a clear reason for that. Country branding is the essence when you are working for your country. Because if you want to, let's say, sell your products, what the buyer is first thinking about is what kind of a perception do you have of the country that's selling its product. And if the country is seen as reliable, having, let's say, traditionally high technology or good design, that of course affects the decision on some level.
Yeah, thank you. And following up on that, it's a cliche, but it seems to me at least that the will to protect the Arctic might seem to increase along with the distance from the region. Washington seemed to be more interested in protection and development of Alaska. That's my impression. I might be wrong here.
That might once have been, but is not now.
That's not well. The times are changing in Washington. But would you like to comment on that, Mayor Berkowitz?
Well, I wish Bob Dylan were running the show instead of the guy we got. I think one of the commonalities that we have in the Arctic is that we're closer to one another than we are to our capitals. And oftentimes, capitals view the North as a place to be exploited or examined or studied, and there's less of a recognition that there are people who live there are ecosystems in place, and those people in those ecosystems have an autonomy of our own. And the more that we can, as people of the North, reiterate that commonality, reiterate the cohesiveness of the northern ecosystem, the better it is. And that's particularly true as nations use the North as a pawn in geopolitical games. And it's important for us to say, we're not pawns, we're people. And the people have a role to play in promoting the kind of policies and exercising the kind of fate control that's important for us to assert our own control over our own destinies.
Yes, thank you. The Arctic Arts Summits brings people together across Arctic borders. How do such gatherings, conferences, and cultural events affect the development of the Arctic region? Tom?
Sure.
You might like to comment on that.
Yeah, the Arctic Council, of course, has many such meetings. But one of the things that I've noticed in all of the travel that I've done around the circumpolar north is first that there's a lot of appetite to get to know each other. I think there's a sense of shared experience that comes along with living in these smaller communities, living in a harsh climate that lowers the barrier to have the first handshake, share the first beer. And I think those things are important. I also do believe that there really is not yet a substitute for face-to-face communication. Skype is great, hurrah, but I don't think there's anything that beats seeing somebody else face-to-face yet. And so, although these gatherings, if you look at Arctic Frontiers, if you look at Arctic Council meetings, or any number of gatherings like this one, you're bringing in people from all over the world. It's a lot of CO2. It's a lot of money. And we do think about those things. That's not something where we're plugging our ears like, la, 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 not happening. We do think about these things, but I think the value of the connections that happen at events like this one can't really be overstated. And just a quick final note, like getting back to the idea that we're not talking about that many people. When you have an Arctic Council SAO meeting, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 people. You can fit everybody into a large bar. And that matters. Or a small one, if everybody's friendly. Yeah, so that's all I would say.
Thank you very much, Tom. Naya, you would like to comment on that?
Yeah, you're right. In that respect, the Arctic community is kind of like a family, right?
It really is.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention on sort of the notion of the Arctic Arts Summit. I find it extremely important in bringing together also a regional cooperation. Now, I'm not only from Greenland. I'm also the Arctic advisor at the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is a regional organization with 8 member states behind it. And it's been a regional organization since 1971. So obviously, regional gatherings, getting to know each other is sort of the core of what we do in the Nordic Council of Ministers. And some activities in that core purpose is obviously convening relevant stakeholders, putting together gatherings that we spoke about. And I'm a big fan of the Arctic Council. I used to work very closely within the council. I'm a big fan of the Arctic Frontiers. I'm a really big fan of the Arctic Circle in Reykjavik, which is sort of brands itself as the Arctic Village. And I'm becoming a big fan of this concept as well, Arctic Arts Summit. Because with all due respect to all the great gatherings we see in the Arctic Council, Arctic Frontiers, and Arctic Circle, there hasn't really been a venue for discussing arts and culture.
Yeah.
So when we were approached by Festspillene in Nord-Norge about having this type of summit on art or on arts and culture, I found it really, really interesting, and I saw the notion of this mobilization that we need to start organizing and start supporting each other in. So we, from the Nordic Council of Ministers, supported this venue with funds as well. And I think this is only the beginning, and we need to build on what we learned before and create that value added that we also look for in the Nordic Council of Ministers.
Yes, Julie, thank you, Naja.
I think this conversation has been one that's, again, ongoing. I think this collaboration has existed. This conversation has been rich. Museums exchange objects and people all the time. Our Finnish partners are here. Our Norwegian partners are here. There's artist exchanges. There's an easy way to exchange people and ideas in the arts and culture community. So again, I think what's important about this summit is not that it's the first, because I think we have these in the arts and culture community. We do have these conversations. They've been developed for a long time. We recognize each other here. We hug each other because this is a new forum, and what's new about it is that we've invited policymakers and people from outside our field to come and participate in this conversation. And I think that's what's valuable and new about it. But again, I want to recognize that these collaborations are rich and strong, and what we're trying to do is raise the profile and to call attention to these partnerships by people outside the sector.
Thank you.
And,
Yes.
and I think I'll just mention, we've talked to you about invading the Arctic Frontiers Conference with the arts and the human element.
Yeah.
We've invaded Arctic Circle, and they have embraced the arts and culture conversation as part of those ongoing discussions. And I think the more we can bring arts and culture to these roundtable discussions where the rest of the ecosystem is there, but the arts and culture are absent, the better the conversation can be. And I think, again, when we gather, it's a healing experience because we recognize each other. So coming from Alaska, I think we spend a lot of energy trying to be recognized by, Alaska is the only reason the U.S. is an Arctic nation, so we fight for our voice and our own government policy. But when we come to these gatherings with our fellow Northerners, it's healing to recognize each other and to remind ourselves of the shared experience and the shared narrative and the shared purpose.
Thank you, Julie. Mayor Berkowitz, you had a comment or a follow-up.
Normally, they say a meeting isn't over until everything's been said and everybody's said it. But one of the unique attributes of dialogue in the North is that we've learned to listen to each other. And because we listen to each other, I think the ability to make progress on the issues that we all confront is perhaps greater than it would be in other parts of the world.
Yes, thank you.
I'd just like to add that I think with the conversations that have been had in the past, the arts have been invited to the table as a decoration. So we provide exhibitions for the hallways, or we have performances in the breaks. And what's important about this is to highlight and integrate the artists into the conversation. So they shouldn't be off to the side, they should be at the table.
Naya.
Yeah, I just really want to concur to that. And I think that's actually what I meant when saying that I see new opportunities, or I see this as a new type of summit or a new kind of venue. I know that obviously you've met and you've gathered throughout the years, but the new element is indeed, translating these conversations within arts and culture into politics, and actually introducing these into the policy makers, and not only being a decoration or a side event that you have while you have your coffee or your wine or your hors d'oeuvres.
On a different topic, we discussed the regional level is getting a stronger place in Arctic collaboration, circumpolar collaboration, and local development has always been important. And also economic development in the north is on the rise, and the fastest growing business sector in northern Norway is the cultural industry. And Anna, would you like to comment on the role of the cultural industry in the Arctic Economic Council and the circumpolar collaboration?
Sure, thank you. One of the 5 overarching themes of the AEC is traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and the role of SMEs. And in our often remote Arctic communities, we do see that most of the businesses there are SMEs, and those form really the backbone of those communities. So of course, local arts are very important also at Aalborg. And one of the aims of the AEC is also to be their voice, because what we see is that the big multinationals have enough resources to always be heard. That's not the case for the small and medium-sized enterprises, which is why we're also their voice.
Thank you. Naya.
Yeah, just to add to that, in the Nordic Council of Ministers, which was also founded on the notion of culture and science, research, and education, we have a strategy on culture, and I have my colleague here who's better at knowing about that than I am. But we have 5 priorities in our strategy. It's having a sustainable Nordic region within culture and arts, an intercultural Nordic region, creative Nordic region, and then addressing young people in that connection, and then a digital Nordic region. And we also have an Arctic cooperation program. That's the one I normally work with. And one of the priorities that all the Nordic cooperation ministers made last year was that a focus on facilitating more economic development and investments. And the thing we did in that connection was actually to commission a study, what we call Arctic Business Analysis, that we're actually doing along with the Arctic Economic Council, where we're exactly looking at the opportunities to increase the awareness of the creative sector as well. So acknowledging the creative sector as being a driver in the economic development as well is what we're looking into. And we hope to present some of the findings at the Arctic Circle this October.
Thank you. Mayor Berkowitz.
I love art, but art's not the panacea. It's not the answer for everything that ails us in the North or opens the door to all of our opportunities. But one of the important reasons why we should be promoting art is that if we can create pride of place in our communities, then we go a long way to instilling the individuals in those communities with hope and the thought that their voices are heard and that their thoughts matter, and that has the effect of lifting people up. And from a just from an investment perspective, a political investment perspective, that comes very much to the front of my mind.
Thank you. On a different note, the Arctic is a very diverse region. Is there an overall ownership to the region among the people living in the Arctic? Would like to address Anu on that question.
Thank you. Well, I have to say that I think that the creation of the AEC in itself is a proof that there is an overall ownership. It all started with the Arctic Council realizing that the increased interest towards the Arctic can also benefit the local peoples and enhance their quality of living, which is why they decided to establish a task force that led to the creation of the AEC. So AEC is really about having the people of the Arctic on the driving seat when it comes to the sustainable development of their region. So yes, I think this is a token of ownership.
The concept of ownership in the North is really interesting. I remember a conversation with that was relayed to me about an elder who said, "We don't own the land, we belong to the land." And I think in the North that's particularly true. And so the concept of ownership is a little bit alien in the Arctic.
I would rather talk about responsibility rather than ownership. And I concur with what you just said. And even in Greenland, you can't own land. And it's not because Greenland is a socialistic society. It's not. It's actually a welfare state with capitalistic sort of grounding. But I think it's more important to talk about responsibility rather than ownership.
Thank you. And how about an Arctic identity? Tom, you're like an Arctic globetrotter, traveling all over the region. Do you see like a common identity in the Arctic region?
Yeah, I at least definitely, and I should be clear here that I am not from the Arctic originally. I was born in Maine in the United States, and I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., so not Arctic. So when in the past 4 years, during which it's been my privilege to travel all over the Arctic, I recognize that I'm looking with an outsider's eye. And so what I'm about to say is what I have seen with that outsider's eye. So please bear that in mind. That being said, what I've noticed is that everywhere that I've gone in the Arctic, there are basic things that people from that region seem to have in common, and they have a lot to do with being on the land. That's one key element. I think being outdoors, gather, whether we're talking about gathering berries and mushrooms in Finland, whether we're talking about reindeer husbandry in North Norway, whether we're talking about hunting and fishing in northern Canada, or really anywhere around the Arctic, being the idea of stewardship and an intimate engagement with the natural world around you is something that I have noticed at least everywhere that I've gone. I would also say that I feel like there's a commonality in that people understand that they need to generate their own culture, their own entertainment. So many people that I know in the Arctic region are amateur musicians, are amateur artists, and it's the same people who are engaged in other aspects of life. It's as I said earlier, I think culture doesn't exist in a bubble in the Arctic. It's a component of everybody's life. So what you see, I think, across the Arctic is that people have these very complete lives that include components of this, that, and the other thing. And I think it's impressive, and it makes people very interesting to meet and get to know. So that's the outsider's view.
Thank you, Tom. Julie.
I think there are two Arctic identities, the one that we all recognize and the imposed one. And I think the next grassroots effort really needs to be, how do we build this shared narrative that recognizes the complexity of our place, takes away the black and white. Right now there are almost 24 reality television shows filmed or about Alaska that's creating a new reality. We think our role is to create a new narrative that's contemporary, that's authentic, that starts to brand the North that we know and that we recognize as Northerners, and to start to add complexity to the imposed definition of the North.
Thank you, Julie. Do any of you have any further comments on that before I open the floor to questions from the audience?
I'll just say one thing.
Yeah?
One thing is, I came to the North the long way around. I worked in the Antarctic before I moved to Alaska. And I've noticed there's what I call a high latitude attitude. You know, people that live on the extremes tend to embrace life a little bit differently than folks in the more temperate zone, and they're more aware of their surroundings. And I think maybe that manifests less as identity and more as personality, but it's there.
Okay, thank you. Maria, would you assist us if there are any questions from the audience or comments? Yes. Yeah, Maria's coming up with it.
My name is Marit Hauan, and I work at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway, as the director at the Tromsø Museum. Yesterday, somebody, I can't remember who, said that we needed to invent, or he encouraged us to invent new words to talk about the Arctic with and around. And I'm a little afraid that when you talk today about Arctic, you are under the sign frontiers. And frontiers and wilderness are the words that I meet when people talk about my background, my homeland, my home. So my question is, do we have the right concepts on the bottom line when we start to discuss? Do we share concepts which we can create further north with, or do we still use the political concepts which actually asks for exploitation, not for developing?
Julie, just wait for the microphone. And,
Thank you for that comment. Coming from the land of the last frontier, we're acutely aware of language and how that brands ourselves. I've talked for years about how I think that's limiting language for our place, that it suggests a colonial perspective, a very short-term history, a very disadvantaged narrative, and that part of our role and part of that grassroots idea that I talk about is to create a new language for the Arctic, and a contemporary language that talks about the future rather than reflects upon a very limited definition of our past. We need to have language that Indigenous people can embrace, that this entire ecosystem can recognize, and I think that's one of our largest tasks, is to recreate the language for the Arctic.
just to comment also on the way that we use the frontier concept in Arctic frontiers is the scientific frontiers meeting the. Indeed, it is. Very good. Okay. Thank you. Yes, please.
Can I just comment on that?
Yes.
I just went to an Arctic conference in Oulu in Finland last week, and that was a conference arranged by the EU, so one of the general directorates and the External Action Service, along with the Finnish government. And the High Representative Federica Mogherini, a politician, a commissioner on a very high level, was there. And she actually addressed this notion of the language that we use. And we spoke a lot about the Arctic. Could we, with legitimacy, call it frontiers? And sort of the general answer was no, we need to look into new language on this. However, the language that was proposed was the gateway. So an opening. It's not an end station, it's an opening, which it could be also. But that's still that's also a limiting factor because it very much addresses the maybe the business interest in the Arctic, which should also be addressed. But I think that's why it's even more important that the peoples of the Arctic are very much aware of this issue and is very much a part of defining the new language that we will use in the future.
Another conference took place in Aulo last week, the Arctic Economic Council Broadband conference, and that was that sort of gateway concept was widely discussed there. Would you like to comment on that, Anu?
Well, yeah, the AEC Arctic Broadband Summit was about connecting people and connecting the Arctic to the rest of the world as well. And I think this is an important aspect that we also need to be aware of. I mean, the Arctic is a very diversified place, as was already mentioned here. We tend to see 4 different types of Arctic in the AEC. North American, Russian, Scandinavian, and interwoven to all of this, you have the indigenous Arctic. So personally, I think that it would be important for us to also educate about the differences and come up with all the different aspects of the Arctic, also to those living south of the Arctic.
Okay, we have. Yes.
I worked on a broadband project across North America, and the reason why we felt it was important is that if you transect, if you cross the Arctic, you reduce latency. Things happen faster. And in some ways, that's a great metaphor for the Arctic today. Things are happening faster in the Arctic, and we ought to take advantage of that. The more we can take advantage of it, the more we define ourselves, the less others will be able to define us. And this is one of the residual consequences of being treated as a colony, not just by the nations that occupy us now or control us now, but historically. And the more the North defines itself, the more the North controls its own future. The North is a place of connection. The North is a place where things happen faster, and we have opportunity on account of that.
Thank you. We have one more question, and then we have to sum up.
My name's Lakuluk Williamson Bathory. I'm a Greenlandic Canadian artist. One of the things that I'd like to comment on about this panel is you have very interesting things to say, especially in regards to the identification of indigenous or Arctic peoples in regards to the South. Now, there's a couple different things about vocabulary, which you mentioned as well, that I'm reacting to a little bit, which involve the idea of modern and traditional. As an artist and as a person that's active in my community, there is no such dichotomy. People are living within our cultures. There's no such thing as that time and this time. It's congruous with one another. The other thing that I was reacting to is you talking about how you've met so many people in the Arctic who are amateur musicians or amateur artists. That's also in regards to what's happening in the rest of the world. When you are creating art, you are doing it as a way of expressing yourself. And as post-colonial people, it's also a way of healing. It's something that comes from within. And that is what really needs to be supported, is that intrinsic, endogamous art-making process. Not so much in regards to identifying ourselves in regards to the South.
Thank you. Would any of you like to comment quickly on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just basically want to concur, and I just came from a plenary session where a Sami artist spoke about her Sami art being superficially treated by the people in power, basically. And one thing we need to acknowledge when we talk about not only arts and culture in the Arctic, but in the Arctic in general, that there's a layer of history, colonialism, post-colonialism, and not least power that we need to address, and we should not just make it a taboo.
Tom, a last. Okay.
Yeah, I just want, there's historic trauma in the North. I mean, there's historic trauma globally, but there's particular historic trauma in the North that has to be confronted and dealt with. And I think that one of the ways we deal with that historic trauma is to go back to traditional values, or what are considered traditional values. And in Alaska, those native values should, and I wish they would, permeate our political culture much more than they do. Issues related to subsistence, issues related to how we live with the land and how we live and treat one another. And those kind of relationships, the definition of those relationships somehow get lost as we incorporate the trappings of more contemporary culture, but they're very important to give us a mooring, a place to stand as the world changes quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think on that note, I would like to thank the panel. Please give them a hand. And thank you all for your attention.